follow me on the campaign trail. And I've got at least one person who's going to vouch for me on that.
Ready to start?
Yeah, I think somebody's in the bathroom right now.
Jack.
Welcome to this rodeo, partner. Oh yeah, I was gonna start recording. Do you want me to record, right?
You can, yeah, set it up. I've got this little streaming thing happening here. It's just for my own benefit.
Do you want video or just audio?
I mean, I'm doing audio and video right here already. But if you want to set up another shot, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm asking quick.
Yeah, do it. I mean, maybe do like a wide shot or something. You know, like something that includes more of the room. Maybe like over, I don't know.
All right. Yeah, I just have to put it in the writing for it. Is that yours? Like, I know it's not mine. Mine's in the car. Yeah,
So who else doesn't have a copy of whatever you wanted?
I read this.
Anybody not have a copy?
This was written.
Well, that's why we're having the class.
Yeah, this was written in what century?
1878.
1878?
Yeah.
Okay, that was written something.
A few years ago. Does anybody need a pen?
What type of pens you got?
Bic round stick. The cheapest pen available in the market. But a marvel of technological advancement and capitalism. The cheapest possible mass-produced pen that works. You wouldn't have it without capitalism.
Jackson's been going on and on about the electric.
Yeah, he's been talking about it.
So I recreated the OJ chase.
Yeah,
With the electric Hummer.
would have gone a lot differently.
I'm gonna put two actually. It would have become
An electric Hummer.
No.
Yeah, that's
All
what
right,
they turned
yeah.
the Full Town plant to, apparently.
Jackson says it's the Pro mobile, apparently.
It's the
So
Pole, yeah. It's an all-terrain electric vehicle.
yeah, I like
Yeah, how's that?
Cool.
Let's
Crude, quick way to download the Facebook.
I already got one.
You have one.
So what you do is you, on a laptop,
Yeah,
you make a picture on
on a phone, right? Yeah.
and then you download it
Oh no,
like
this thing is like 8 hours.
Try to send me the link.
download your laptop, then you upload it.
Send me the link
Jackson, am I in the
later.
frame?
No, I took you out of
But
frame.
it
You want to be in the frame?
looks like it's on a phone.
Yeah.
It's not a
Because
full
I'm
screen,
just gonna be like taking notes. And,
Yeah.
You know,
Are you streaming right now?
No, I was just gonna
You're
take
just gonna
regular video.
record?
I can stream.
No, do it however you want to do it. I'm actually streaming.
You guys want to go stream?
Yeah, streaming.
Like 30.
Okay. Okay. Should I do it on like Facebook or should I do it on our YouTube channel?
I don't care.
Either way,
Whatever works.
Yeah, someone give me the Facebook login then?
If you have the YouTube thing,
Yeah, I don't know what the Facebook login is.
just do your YouTube thing. Just because you already have that logged in, probably, right?
we're gonna have to write a manual.
The CWA way.
Hey.
Oh, it was similar to this one.
I took a class on mission policy.
Oh, it was on my old one. It was like a Pikachu, and it was like a Pikachu from the field.
New education spending.
Anytime people rise up, I guess it's okay.
Oh, the woman that spoke today, she said, listen, we're in a state of emergency. If we were in a state of emergency, we would have been arrested.
That's why
we got that outside of the 500 cops out. We'd have arrested all of us.
Apparently it's being weird. I'm just gonna record
Just
it.
record it.
I guess they have YouTube has a thing because you have to be bullying.
Oh, I know. I've dealt with this. That's why I'm using the laptop right now. I'm doing it on YouTube. What? Oh, good. Yeah, I have my coffee. I've been drinking so much coffee too.
I've been doing 2 of those a day, like to get through school and stuff.
This is my second one. All right. Good?
Yeah.
It's okay if it's. No, it's not.
I'm sorry, what?
All right, so we're gonna get rid of
Frame
this.
is right here, so I can see you guys. Okay, yeah.
All right, we haven't started yet.
It's like right here.
Unbelievable.
He's making a joke.
I am disgusted.
Why?
This is reprehensible.
Okay, you ready? It's
You got it? Just
Down.
Order is recorded.
This. Yep.
okay.
There you go. It's recording.
All right, cool. Grab a seat. All right, thanks everybody for coming. We could start by just doing intros. I'm Jason with CWL, Communist Workers League.
David.
How about your name with CWL?
Sharon with CWL.
Derek, CWL.
Mike, CWL.
My name is Mitchell. I'm a student on Wednesday.
Sherry Wells with the Green Party.
Nathan also.
Alex, same, also. Jackson, CWL.
Abby.
Joey.
Awesome. So thanks for coming. First, does everybody have the text? Okay, cool. I just want to get a sense of I'm just going to kind of lead this discussion. I'm going to talk for a little while before we get started, do a little bit of an intro, and then we're going to read paragraphs. I'll do the first one, and then we'll kind of just go around. So before we get started, I'm curious who here has read this chapter, this text already?
Yeah, not understood, but read.
Cool, great, no problem. Yeah. Has anyone read, or who's read the full text? Okay, cool. And then what about Communist Manifesto? Just out of curiosity, has everybody pretty much read that, or? Okay, some people not, but okay, cool. Yeah, like I said, I'm just gonna basically, we're gonna go through, but before we get into it, I want to kind of give a little bit of background about why we're here, why we decided to do this. Oh, that's awesome. So almost everyone has read the manifesto. Okay, so I actually read this book not too long ago, maybe like 8 months ago, and I came in, I had this idea that I wanted to do this. I wanted to read through it and do kind of a class on it. So I'm actually just still learning. I consider myself somebody who's like actively getting into theory and learning theory, not like an expert on it, but I do think that it's really valuable as somebody who's learning to sort of learn as a group with other people. I've told some different people this idea that I have about learning, where I think of political education kind of like an avalanche, kind of like snow on a mountaintop. That when somebody begins to learn and they begin to kind of open up their mind, you start to sort of slide, and other people go with you. So it's sort of like everyone's kind of shifting as a big group. We're all kind of learning together. So that's the spirit with which I come into this. Is not like somebody who knows everything about it, but as somebody who's actively educating himself, and I want other people to sort of be doing it with me, because I think that's the best way for it all to work. I think that's really exciting. So obviously with that, there's going to be people who've read this a long time ago, spent a lot of time with the material, And those people's insights are going to be really valuable here, clearly. And then there are going to be people who are new to it. And those people are super valuable also because it's your initial observations and some of your initial questions as you're reading it for the first time. To vocalizing those is a way to sort of understand the text anew. It's a really exciting way to kind of have it feel fresh. So it's good that there's a variety of people. The next thing I want to say before we start, I wanted to talk a little bit about why I think it's important to read theory, because in this group, in CWL, and other groups that meet in this space, we do a lot of topical meetings about things that are going on in the world, things that are going on in Detroit, and that sort of thing. But it's also really important to read theory. And there's a great teacher, I think, is David Harvey, who teaches Capital, and he talks about how there are a lot of people for the many years he's been teaching theory. People said, in the 70s, they said, well, it feels like this is kind of like dusty old text, and the world's going on outside. But what I think is interesting is that he talks about how there's really no separation between theory and what's going on out in the world. When you read theory, when you understand it well, it applies so directly to what we do outside. I think that's it's so fascinating to read something for me, and I think this is going to change the way I'm going to do activism from now on, or this is going to change the way I organize from now on. Like, I'll never go back to the old way because I've learned something. So I think that's really important. And, I think there's another reason that people say not to read theory more now, today, because, we live in a culture now with tweets and memes and headlines and, just short bits of information that are much easier to digest. A lot of times people feel like something this long, or something as long as Capital, which is 3 huge books, it feels like, how are you supposed to take all the time to really get into all of that? But what's amazing about theory is that it doesn't offer you a tiny little bit of information the way a tweet does, or the way a meme does. You can get across tiny bits of information that way, but theory allows you to have a complete view of the world, or a complete understanding as you read the long form. So I think that's the goal here, is not to just get a little information here, to start to build a deeper, large-scale understanding. That's the way I look at it. The reason that I chose this text, or why I brought up the idea of reading Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, and the reason I think it was so great for me to read, was because, obviously now, recently, there's attention towards socialism in this country. You have like Bernie Sanders and stuff, and people going around and saying socialism, and it doesn't seem like a bad thing. But it's really worthwhile in that instance to say, what is socialism? And what are some different definitions of socialism that people have? What definition do we want to focus on? And what are different definitions that we might want to criticize? Or, just understand. I'm not here, I don't think this is about sort of saying, when we read this text, scientific socialism is it. Utopian socialism, we're just going to trash it all day. I mean, we could do that, but it's interesting even to understand what utopian socialism is. If you're interested in that, this text can just kind of educate you about it. And the reason we're doing the first chapter is just because it's long. So, maybe if this is successful, we'll come back and do more chapters. The first chapter gives history, and it talks about some of the early utopian socialist thinkers. This class is basically, the way I think about it, and I do kind of think about it as a class as well as a reading and discussion, but I think we mainly just want to understand the text itself, and maybe later they could get into a sort of debates about the sort of utopian versus scientific socialism, or maybe anarchism versus communism, or just different debates that people want to have. But for now, we're just going to try to understand what Engels is saying in this text, and then move on from there. And then, like I said, let's just, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get started with the first paragraph in a minute here. And I think it would be a good idea for us to basically pause pretty often. And because this is dense, it's really dense material. And what we can do is basically read a paragraph. And a lot of times we just want to read a paragraph. And after the paragraph, literally analyze that paragraph. And after that, maybe if people have observations or things that they connect in their mind, like this reminds me of so-and-so, we can make observations, and then people will probably also have questions. So basically, we'll do a paragraph, we'll do analysis, we'll do people's observations, and any questions that people have. That's kind of the, let's try it from that kind of platform. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay. All right. So, all that being said, let's dive right in. Actually, wait. Before I go, quickly, the one thing I want to do, because I think context is really important, just for reference, very quickly. Communist Manifesto, it was published in 1848. Capital Volume 1 was 1867, if people are familiar with all this stuff. This essay was 1878, so this is after Capital 1. Marx died 1883, and then Capital Volume 2 was 1885, and then Capital 3 was 1894. So this comes in the middle of all that stuff. It's after the Manifesto, it's after Capital 1, and it's just, I think, important to sort of understand the timeline of some of these things. So, cool. I'm going to get started. All right. So, Engels, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Part 1. Modern socialism is, in its essence, the direct product of the recognition, on the one hand, of the class antagonisms existing in the society of today between proprietors and non-proprietors, between capitalists and wage workers. On the other hand, of the anarchy existing in production. But in its theoretical form, modern socialism originally appears ostensibly as a more logical extension of the principles laid down by the great French philosophers of the 18th century. Like every new theory, modern socialism had, at first, to connect itself with the intellectual stock and trade ready to its hand, however deeply its roots lay in material economic facts. Cool. So I'm going to just keep going here, basically, and then people can chime in. But I think right out of the gate, is there somebody joining us?
Yes, somebody's coming.
Okay, cool. Welcome. We just started. All right, so basically right out of the gate, we see the thesis statement of Engels. He is going to talk about what his take on what socialism is, or maybe more importantly, what socialism comes out of, right? So he says here, it's the direct product of the recognition of these class antagonisms. So the class antagonisms exist. The recognition of those brings forth socialism. That's what happens. And it's not just class antagonisms, but also what he calls anarchy existing in production, which is kind of more to do with how capitalism works or doesn't work very well, that sort of thing. We'll get more into that later. But what he's saying here is that it's that recognition of those antagonisms and those problems that brings capitalism out. Brings socialism out. But in its theoretical form, he's saying, so this contrasts with another idea, which is that socialism was originally thought of as something that was basically thought up by philosophers, right? Like philosophers in, the great French philosophers of the 18th century, they thought up these ideas. It was something that came out of their brain, and they realized, aha, this is what needs to happen, So it's basically from the beginning, he's just contrasting those two concepts. Yeah.
will we be, can we ask questions on each chapter?
Yeah, I think we should just now. If does anybody want to ask? Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, the most part that I heard while I was answering.
Yeah.
But, you know, I like terms to be explained and defined for me because I get a better understanding that way. Like when it says the anarchy existing in production, what exactly does that mean?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that first of all, he's going to go into that a lot, but he goes into it later in the text, not even in the first chapter, a lot, mainly. So just quickly, and I think other people should chime in here. But anarchy in production is something that in capitalism, you see things like just crashes, economic crashes, boom and bust, this cycle of just things just not really seeming to work very well. Took a lot of notes on this whole first section, but basically just a lack of organization of how goods are actually distributed. I think a lot of people would say it's the difference between a planned economy versus just like a free economy. Do you want to?
Yeah, I was about to say, I believe that, like, yeah, what you were saying, that the anarchy in production means, like, the whole, especially back in the context of what time this was, because this was before, like, like, here there was, like, all the, trade busting and everything, so this was, like, the most free that a market could get, so there was no regulation, no basic organization from the government, so basically, capitalists, especially in that time, had free reign to do whatever they wanted, which, anarchy in production, which frequently caused crashes, booms, and crashes again.
Yeah. Does that?
I think we have a good example. Those that live in Michigan or in the Midwest, the auto industry is an excellent example of anarchy in production.
Yeah.
You can have, we've gone through periods of time where all of a sudden there's 10, 20, 30 too many auto plants in the world today, and then there's massive layoffs ensue. Part of what the anarchy of production is that there's no central planning. Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Chrysler, whatever, they don't plan their production to meet our needs. They plan their production to maximize profit. So we end up in these ridiculous situations where you see it's clear that a bunch of people in Detroit need new cars, especially new cars that aren't gas guzzlers, to replace their 1980s General Motors VMS that they're driving down the freeway. But they can't get their hands on one of these brand new cars that's out there, and instead we lay off workers, and it does this boom and bust. But it's part of this anarchy is inability. It's not the inability. It's the unwillingness of the capitalists to plan anything, because they don't have to. They just have to plan to maximize profits. So we actually, other example is we end up where people need food, right? But we throw it away because the people that need the food can't afford it. So we end up dumping milk into ditches or whatever. And I just want to recount, I had a Chinese office mate while I was working. And I told her, did you hear? They're dumping milk over in some state. And she goes, no, they don't do that in this country. She says, they went through a system in China, She says, they told us that in school in China, but I thought it was propaganda. I never thought anybody would actually do this. And then she added, they teach us from a different perspective, some Marxist Leninist perspective. I went, okay, yeah. But anyway, that's part of the anarchy is that we're throwing stuff away when people need it.
Yeah, it's chaos.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, I wanted to continue on, but I think the housing situation here in Detroit would be a prime example of anarchy. But I think both of you guys answered before me. It's just basically a planned economy to the market system,
Which is
anarchy.
chaotic and anarchistic,
So anywhere, and it's not planned for our needs.
Yes.
It needs to be unregulated in order to thrive.
Yes. It's totally.
Unregulated would be
Yeah.
a good way to say anarchy.
Yeah, a final thing I was going to add on what he was saying, that another part of the anarchy, like, you know, since there's no plan, there's no plan or anything, that that capitalists overproduce, which is one of Marx's points was about capitalism, is that like every other system for capitalism, a crisis would happen because there wasn't enough food or something. There was not enough. But in capitalism, economic crises come into being because the capitalists didn't want to, generate so much profit that they overproduce, and then
the first time we've had a crisis of overproduction in history. So
yeah, I was thinking in terms of housing. With the loans they were giving out, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, they produced all of these financial packages, and at some point they just collapsed, and it almost destroyed the world capitalist system. It had been bailed out by the capitalist governments. So that's another good example of overproduction, but not necessarily in terms of auto production. They're using financial packages as a means of maximizing profit. So now it's with apartments.
Yeah.
Here, so many rental units, and at some point, we probably already starting to see it happen. The demand is going to start declining, and if the rents don't go down, it's going to be another crisis in the city.
Crises are happening all the time.
Yeah.
Just for those who can mention food. Oh yeah. So for anyone who just came in, by the way, we have food. We have pizza and salad that Sean made, and coffee and pop, and cake. So okay. So before we move on, I just want to quickly link back in, because this is the beginning. It's really important to get it right. We're talking about anarchy existing in production. He also talks about class antagonisms, which I think is not that hard to understand, the difference between capitalists and the workers, that antagonism. So those two things, the anarchy and the class antagonism, are the realization of that is what socialism sprung out of. Because those things existed, socialism came into being. The realization of those things brought it out. And what he's doing is he's contrasting that idea from the idea that somebody first thought up socialism in their head before any of those things are ever existed, or maybe long after they existed. The point is, it originated in someone's head. Did you? I don't know. So you're shaking your head.
I just thought of, because disagreement, because another example I can think of that's more, people credit Adam Smith as a lot of people that don't really know much about Adam Smith, they credit him as he's the guy who formulated capitalism, how he didn't formulate it, he just detailed how it worked. That's what these philosophers were doing. They weren't I invented this new system. It's no, it's just how it would work.
Yeah, 100%. So I think that's enough on paragraph 1. I think we get everything on that. Because he's going to go way more into this. So does anybody want to pick up with the next?
Paragraph 2. The great men who in France prepared men's minds for the coming revolution were themselves extreme revolutionists. They recognized no external authority of any kind whatever. Religion, natural science, society, political institutions, everything was subjected to the most unsparing criticisms. Everything must justify its existence before the judgment seat of reason or give up existence. Reason became the sole measure of everything. It was a time when, as Hegel says, the world stood upon its head. First in the sense that the human head and the principles arrived at it by its thought, claimed to be the basis of all human action and association, but by and by also, in the wider sense, that the reality which was in contradiction to these principles had in fact to be turned upside down. Every form of society and government then existed. Every old traditional notion was flung into the lumber room of irrational. The world had hitherto allowed itself to be led solely by prejudices. Everything in the past deserved only pity and contempt. Now, for the first time, appeared the light of day, the kingdom of reason. Henceforth, superstition, injustice, privilege, oppression were to be superseded by eternal truth, eternal right, equality based on nature, and the inalienable rights of man. Should I go on or just quite a bit in that paragraph?
Do you want to break anything down from the paragraph? Or?
Well, he seems to be talking about the period of enlightenment, the 17th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, where people wanted to go beyond superstition and prejudice. He also acknowledges that the people who were socialists or revolutionaries were genuine in their approach, but at the same time there were limitations, based on their ideology, which he'll get into later.
Right. Yeah.
Can somebody break down what is meant by reason became the sole measure of everything, or did I be on this screen?
Okay, David, you want to tell us?
So remember, we're talking about the period under feudalism, which we're talking about the kings and the nobles and the lords and ladies and their castles and their extravagances, and them living, this class, the feudal nobility, living off of the work of the poorest peasants who were virtual serfs or slaves almost. But at the same time, another system was developing of trade and industry and commerce. That's the capitalist class. That's who they call the bourgeoisie. And so here, if you're a bourgeois, if you're working, and then we're not talking about Rockefellers and Mellons and Morgan, we're talking about people who were just starting this system, and they were working, and side by side they may have hired some workers and selling things, but they were laboring, and they made something of themselves if they worked hard and if they could get their workers to work hard. But they were being taxed to support this ridiculous class of nobility who didn't do anything. And that's where the demand for reason came in, because it was, to them, it was unreasonable. And you can draw your own conclusions for today, but it was, in that period, it was unreasonable to have these lords and ladies and fancy balls and all this, queens and and a whole class of thousands of nobility, popes and abbots and bishops and stuff, and they all were living off of working people who were not clearly, there were workers and there were capitalists, but it wasn't like today. The capitalists were more small scale, and that irritated the shit out of people. And that's what philosophers had to try to justify or reason about this. Said it was unreasonable. We want equality with, the nobility shouldn't be above everything. They didn't have to pay taxes. And that's where that came from, this demand for reason. And he'll explain in the next paragraph, it was a limited call for reason, but it was based on this changes in society.
Well, I would just add, I think, that the belief before this was the divine right of kings, that came from God, and they were anointed by God. And so everybody sort of had to believe that because there was nothing else.
Yeah.
I would also add on with that is why they kind of question their superstitions, like because of that, because the fundamental thing, like the fundamental parts of society was all based around like what religion and what like your bishop was telling you to do. So you had to really be unscrupulous in what you were saying, because everything in your entire existence is based around like these superstitions.
Right. So reason, came into prominence. I think, so should we continue on? Does somebody want to read the next paragraph? Maybe we should let people, seems like there's okay. Sharon said she wanted to read it. We got it.
Okay, we're into the third paragraph.
Third paragraph.
We know today that the kingdom of reason is nothing more than the idealized kingdom of the bourgeoisie. That this eternal right found its realization in bourgeois justice, that this equality reduced itself to bourgeois equality before the law. The bourgeoisie party property was proclaimed as one of the essential rights of man, and that the government of reason, the contract social of Rousseau, came into being and only could come into being as a democratic bourgeois republic. The great thinkers of the 18th century could no more than their predecessors go beyond the limits imposed upon them by their epoch.
Sorry. Yeah, James.
I think this is just a great analysis of like what led to the French Revolution, because I believe that's what they're talking about here with the fundamental rights of man. Was just like how limited the French Revolution was. No matter how we want to talk about it, how good it was, the government and nobility was still incredibly limited by like these thoughts of the time, because they couldn't understand anything that would happen beyond capitalism, as capitalism was just burgeoning out of its seams. And so they came up with all these like laws they designed entirely for capitalism, as that's all they could imagine, and thought that was the cutting edge of like progressivism and how society would develop.
Right. Yeah. A lot of this is around the French Revolution. This whole text. So.
Yeah, so when you read, we know today that this kingdom of reason was nothing more than an idealized kingdom of the bourgeoisie. Then it went on to like kind of tell about, well, these rights these philosophers talked about were really only, went to the bourgeois. I think that's even relevant today, because the First Amendment comes to mind now, came to mind when this was being read. It's like, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. Leftist media has been censored so much by the bourgeois, apparatus, and the same thing can be said about during, freedom of protest is another one. During the civil rights movement, for example, you had all these people marching for, equal rights. Well, they weren't even, most of the time they weren't being violent at all. They were being peaceful. They were following how they even told you to do it, but they were still being attacked and stuff like that. So I think what it's trying to say is that these principles that these, French philosophers that they came up with that were originally supposed to be interpreted as for everyone really only became applicable to the bourgeois itself. People like the proletariat, for instance, didn't really apply to them because it wasn't, because like it said, it could only could come into being as a democratic bourgeois republic.
Right. Absolutely. I think, yeah, and with reason, we see these abstract notions of rights. That's sort of what reason offers up when it comes out. It's liberty, and yeah, you mentioned freedom of speech. It's a very abstract way of thinking. Okay. Does somebody want to read the next? Okay.
But side by side with the antagonisms of feudal nobility and the burghers, who claimed to represent all the rest of society, was the general antagonism of the exploiters and the exploited, of the rich idlers and the poor workers. It was this very circumstance that it was made possible for the representatives of the bourgeoisie to put themselves forward as representing not one special class, but the whole suffering of humanity. Still further, from its origins, the bourgeoisie was saddled with the antithesis, capitalists cannot exist without wage workers, and in the same proportion as the medieval burghers of the guilds developed into the modern bourgeoisie, the guild journeyman and the day laborer outside of the guilds developed into the proletarian. And although, upon the whole, the bourgeois in their struggle with the nobility could claim to represent at least the same interests of the different working classes of that period, yet every great bourgeois movement there was independent outbursts of that class, which was the forerunner, more or less developed of the modern proletariat. For example, at the time of the German Reformation and the Peasants' War, the Anabaptists and Thomas Munzer, thank you, and the Great English Revolution and the Levers in the French Revolution and
Babeuf. Think. So there's a lot of good history in this text. So it's great to go and read up about each of these things, but we won't go into it too much. But I mean, one of the things he's talking about here is how when this revolution came along and overthrew the feudal system, it was the bourgeoisie doing that overthrow. But while they were doing it, they were bundled together with what he's calling the forerunners of the proletariat, and they together as one group claimed to represent all the rest of society. But then, what he's going to start to get at here towards the end is that as this begins to happen, we begin to see that there is an antagonism in this supposed grouping that was doing this revolution. That this group that claimed to be all the rest of us, or the third estate, as sometimes people call it, that they said us, the workers, that actually inside of that there was a big antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and that begins to show itself when we see these early other little mini uprisings within that bigger uprising, like the Anabaptists, like the Levelers, and like Babeuf.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I think it's important where he points out how people were still rising up against oppression, even in the 16th century. Because even within the church, I mean, people like Martin Luther, for example, in the German Reformation, the peasant wars, during the middle of the 16th century. I mean, they represented, people who were rising up against nobility, against the church, the landlords, and so forth. Even though they didn't have the capacity, to seize power in their own name, but still, they were still rising up.
Yeah, and he's going to talk about how those were, at that time, right, they didn't have the capacity.
Yeah.
They weren't developed to the point where they were ready to then move on to the next stage, but it was an early sign that something was going to eventually change. And he talks a lot about things in embryo and just this process of the advancement, which he's going to get into later, called historical materialism. This is an early hint at that. This process that continues driving forward.
I just want to mention, so we don't have time to talk about those three that he mentions, but giving you dates for them. The Peasant Wars, that was around 1525, and these were left-wing, pre-socialist formation, the Anabaptists, against Luther, and were crushed by the movement led by Luther. That was the early 1500s. And the Levelers, that's around 1648 or so, under the Cromwell Revolution, capitalist revolution. And they were crushed. And as their name sounds, that's what they wanted, everyone to have exactly the same amount of things. And Babeuf was crushed in the French Revolution, that's 1789 to 94 or so, a little after that. So 100 years apart, but they were emerging in those big revolutions. There are already like you said, embryonic poor and working people's rebellions inside those movements.
Does anybody have any questions or other observations? Maybe we should just move on to the next one. Okay, who wants to read the next paragraph?
All right. These were theoretical enunciations corresponding with these revolutionary uprisings of a class not yet developed. In the 16th and 17th centuries, utopian pictures of ideal social conditions. In the 18th century, actual communistic theories, Morelli and Ablé. The demand for equality was no longer limited to political rights. It was extended also to the social conditions of individuals. It was not simply class privileges that were to be abolished, but class distinctions themselves. A communism ascetic, denouncing all the pleasures of life, Spartan was the first form of the new teaching. Then came three great utopians: Saint Simon, to whom the middle class movement, side by side with the proletarian, still had a certain significance. Fourier and Owen, who in the century where capitalist production was the most developed, and under the influence of antagonisms begotten of this, worked out his proposals for the removal of class distinction systematically and in direct relation to French materialism.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is a really good paragraph, and it's like we could break this down, but it continues to break itself down as we go forward. But I think the one thing I take from this is that there's actually a lot good here to take away. You have to understand the idea that coming up with the that during these revolutions that had just happened, the idea that to say, hey, let's not just fight for political rights, let's fight for social condition betterment for ourselves. That's a huge idea to come out. That's really impressive. And it is a huge part of the next step to say, like, yeah, we're not just looking for abstract notions of liberty. We're actually looking for better lives for all the people, you know. And so that's he's going to go on to to criticize the way in which they do it, perhaps. But that's really important to understand what they did by coming up with that next step. He says here that a communism ascetic denouncing all the pleasures of life, Spartan was the new teaching. I want to study this more, but to me it sounds like what they were coming up with was this idea that, like, well, we should all just have simple, like, they kind of resent those amongst their revolutionary movement that now are in positions of great power. Now they kind of look like they're the new rulers, the new rich people. That, like, why aren't we all the same, like the levelers, So this idea, like, they were putting forth an early idea of communism that was sort of like that. Yeah, I mean, that's really what's going on here, I think. And he brings up these three names: Saint Simon, Fourier, and Owen, who he's going to go into a lot of depth on. Yeah.
Is the Spartan talking about Sparta, in Greece, or?
No, yeah,
It comes from that.
I think it's more just meaning like spare and kind of not like kind of austere, like not fancy, basically. I think.
Because that was thousands of years before.
Yeah, right.
They just had the movie.
What?
Spartacus.
Yeah.
What's all this movie?
Yeah. Does any? Yeah.
Yeah, these two paragraphs look like they're going together, I thought.
Oh, did you want to read the next?
Yeah, the next two.
Oh, yeah, great.
One thing is common to all three. Not one of them appears as a representative of the interests of that proletariat, which historical development had, in the meantime, produced. Like the French philosophers, they do not claim to emancipate a particular class to begin with, but all humanity at once. Like them, they wish to bring in the kingdom of reason and eternal justice. But this kingdom, as they see it, is as far as heaven from earth, from that of the French philosophers. For to our three social reformers, the bourgeois world, based upon the principles of these philosophers, is quite as irrational and unjust, and therefore finds its way to the dust hole quite as readily as feudalism and all the earlier stages of society. If pure reason and justice have not hitherto ruled the world, this has been the case only because men have not rightly understood them. What was wanted was the individual man of genius who has now arisen and who understands the truth. That he has now arisen and that the truth has now been clearly understood is not an inevitable event, following a necessity in the chains of historical development, but a mere happy accident. He might just as well have been born 500 years earlier and might then have spared humanity 500 years of error, strife, and suffering.
Does anybody want to make observations of it? Or, I mean, I think that this is a another really key to couple of paragraphs. Because he right now he starts tying some stuff together that he's talked about before. If you remember, he talked about the idea that reason came into being and swept out the kings and queens of superstition, right? And now we have these new people on the scene, Saint Simon, Fourier, and Owen, who are now sort of advocating for their concept of a communism, an early communism. But what he's talking about here in the second paragraph especially is that they're pretty much using the same method that the French philosophers used, was to say, we're coming up with a better reason. Like we're applying reason further, and we're going to like brush away everything that came before was all wrong. Like he says, that just the same way they also wipe everything prior back into the dust hole. He said, and he spends a lot of time talking here about, it was just a spontaneous thing that somebody thought this up. He could have been born 500 years ago, and we could have been spared all those years of suffering. But because he wasn't born until this time, we had to wait for this genius individual to come up with the idea. He's saying it's not an inevitable event that this would happen because of the social conditions around us. It's not the arrangement of the classes and the antagonisms that we see that caused us to want to do this revolution. It was somebody's genius individual plan that they thought up in their head to do this, and that's what that's now he's going to start to sort of draw a distinction between these three that he calls the utopian socialists versus himself and Marx, who are scientific socialists, and the difference between the way they apply their their philosophy of how they work, basically. Does that make sense? Or, does anyone have like any other thoughts? Or, I think this is just like a really big.
I think it's kind of an extension of what you said, but it's just pointing out that they're kind of absolutely. They're kind of detaching themselves materially and historically from all of the context that has preceded them, and they're making it into this argument that they alone are the ones who emerged from all of that with nothing to influence them but their own brains, when in actuality everything that they've ever conceived of and everything that they came up with was based in their material conditions and their social conditions. And to discredit that is irresponsible, but also shows that there's a flawed way that they're thinking about it. So Jason, that's
Sorry? Oh. Yeah, there's, yeah.
I just want to say that, Engels is so clear in his writing. And, he has such a nice understanding of history. And he brings it in and he takes you with him along his thinking journey. And it's quite exciting.
There's a theory that they reject, which is called the great man theory, which is, I think this is a really just where he really does it right here. It's this idea that a great man came along and changed history with his brain. That it's not the world out there that changes or gives people the ideas that they even have in the first place. It was this great man's idea that started in his head that he put out. So he's basically fully rejecting the theory of the great man of history. That's not at all what Engels believes.
I wasn't saying that.
No, I'm not saying that to you. I was just looking at you as I said that. But I think it's just important to talk about the great man theory because it's like a big anchor, I think, to this, or even just the early part of this text, is that he's basically doing away with the great man theory. So, all right. So, who wants to read the next? I'll do it. All right. We saw how the French philosophers of the 18th century, the forerunners of the Revolution, appealed to reason as the sole judge of all that is. A rational government, rational society were to be founded. Everything that ran counter to eternal reason was to be remorselessly done away with. We also saw that this eternal reason was in reality nothing but the idealized understanding of the 18th century citizen, just then evolving into the bourgeois. The French Revolution had realized this rational society and government. Whoa, all right, I'm just going to keep that. But the new order of things, rational enough as compared with earlier conditions, turned out to be by no means absolutely rational. The state based upon reason completely collapsed. Rousseau's contrat social had found its realization in the Reign of Terror, from which the bourgeoisie, who had lost confidence in their own political capacity, had taken refuge first in the corruption of the Directorate and finally under the wing of the Napoleonic despotism. The promised eternal peace was turned into an endless war of conquest. The society based on reason had fared no better. The antagonism between rich and poor, instead of devolving into general prosperity, had become intensified by the removal of the guild and other privileges which had to some extent bridged it over, and by the removal of the charitable institutions of the church. The freedom of property from feudal fetters, now veritably accomplished, turned out to be, for the small capitalists and small proprietors, the freedom to sell their small property, crushed under the overmastering competition of the large capitalists and landlords, to these great lords, and thus, as far as the small capitalists and peasant proprietors were concerned, became freedom from property. The development of industry upon a capitalistic basis made poverty and misery of the working masses conditions of existence of society. Cash payment became more and more, in Carlyle's phrase, the sole nexus between man and man. The number of crimes increased from year to year. Formerly, the feudal vices had openly stalked about in broad daylight. Though not eradicated, they were now at any rate thrust into the background. In their stead, the bourgeois vices, hitherto practiced in secret, began to blossom all the more luxuriantly. Trade became to a greater and greater extent cheating. The fraternity of revolutionary motto was realized in the chicanery and rivalries of the battle of competition. Oppression by force was replaced by corruption. The sword, as the first social lever, by gold. The right of the first knight was transferred from the feudal lords to the bourgeois manufacturers. Prostitution increased to an extent never heard of. Marriage itself remained, as before, the legally recognized form, the official cloak of prostitution, and moreover was supplemented by rich crops of adultery.
And so it began.
I think on page 2 with that first couple sentences, I think it's definitely very he goes in on the Church of the Supreme Being that Robespierre forms, I think, pretty hard right there, just due to the fact that they were so self-obsessed with this point of rationality that they would base their whole worldview and how everything would act on, is this rational? Oh, if it's not rational, it must be refused and they must be guillotined for not being wholeheartedly rational. And I just think, yeah, it's entirely idealist to have such a view that everything can just exist in a rational space and everything is wholeheartedly rational, wholeheartedly otherwise, while not recognizing how unrational not having central planning and just allowing the market to do whatever it wants is. I just found that was very interesting. And then as for the second part, just no one really hears about the evils that come about when people switch from feudalism to capitalism. You get the standard, the guillotines, whatever, and death of landlords and things like that, but you don't hear how fundamentally an individual's life changes, and I think Engels goes in on that pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he's talking a lot about what that transition was like. I think he does a pretty good job at laying out some pretty big problems. Yeah.
This has nothing to do with class, but our comrade Jennifer just brought in some very tasty chocolate chip cookies. Want to gain some weight? Chew them up.
They're vegan, so.
Oh, okay.
Oh, they're vegan too.
Yes.
Wow.
They're
That was why I was late, so it's fine.
It's
No
still
problem.
warm.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yes.
more or less outlining the
And my dog was
changing of
very
the guard.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, the feudal lords are, in a sense, usurped, although they still exist in this context. But it's the capitalists, the burgeoning capitalists, who are really the ones who are in control of the economic trajectory in bourgeois capitalist society. So.
Yeah.
I think it's important. He has this huge paragraph because philosophers had predicted my philosophy, rationality, the French Revolution should inaugurate this equal society, and they became more unequal in different ways. And that is a crisis of ideas. And somebody's going to have to understand. You know, you can read Rousseau and all these folks, but what they promised didn't happen. And even then, people understood this didn't happen, and new ideas were going to be needed to help explain it to people. So that's what's coming.
Right. It's interesting. Like reading it multiple times also brings out stuff. So it's interesting that he's talking about, like you said, rationality was supposed to make everything more equal, but it didn't. I think there's on the background of everything he's saying, well, here comes people that are going to try to apply rationality again to fix the problem, but they're going to use the same method again, and they're saying it will really work this time. But it's interesting to see how he breaks out how it didn't work, how it failed. We should just keep plowing through. Yeah, we got a lot. Who else wants to read?
Okay, I can read. Okay. In a word, compared with other, no, excuse me. In a word, compared with the splendid promises of philosophers, the social and political institutions born of the, quote, triumph of reason, end quote, were bitterly disappointing caricatures. All that was wanting was the men to formulate this disappointment, and they came with the turn of the century. In 1802, Saint-Simon's Geneva Letters appeared. In 1808 appeared Fourier's first work, although the groundwork of this theory dated from 1799. On January the 1st of 1800, Robert Owen undertook the direction of New Lanark. At this time, however, the capitalist mode of production, and with it the antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, was still very incompletely developed. Modern industry, which had just arisen in England, was still unknown in France. But modern industry develops, on the one hand, the conflicts which make absolutely necessary a revolution in the mode of production, and the doing away with this capitalist character. Conflicts not only between the classes begotten of it, but also between the very productive forces and the forms of exchange created by it. And on the other hand, it develops in these very gigantic productive forces the means of ending these conflicts, and therefore about the year 1800, the conflicts arising from the new social order were only just beginning to take shape. This holds still more fully as to the means of ending them. The, quote, have-nothing, unquote, masses of Paris during the Reign of Terror were able for a moment to gain mastery, and thus to lead the bourgeois revolution to victory in spite of the bourgeoisie themselves. But in doing so, they only proved how impossible it was for their domination to last under the conditions then obtaining. The proletariat, which then, for the first time, evolved itself from these, quote, have-nothing, unquote, masses as the nucleus of a new class, as yet quite incapable of independent political action, appeared as an oppressed, suffering order to whom in its incapacity to help itself, help could, at best, be brought in from without or down from above. Should I continue on? I think the next paragraph is really important.
Okay.
This historical situation also dominated the founders of socialism. To the crude conditions of capitalist production and the crude class conditions correspond crude theories. The solution of the social problems, which as yet lay hidden in underdeveloped economic conditions, the utopians attempted to evolve out of the human brain. Society presented nothing but wrongs. To remove these was the task of reason. It was necessary then to discover a new and more perfect system of social order, and to impose this upon society from without by propaganda, and wherever it was possible, by the example of model experiments. These new social systems were foredoomed as utopian. The more completely they were worked out in detail, the more they could not avoid drifting into pure fantasies. I think he's referring to like the utopian communities and the communes that were set up, in the 18th century, 19th century. Of course, there were a lot of them in the 20th century as well. And they probably still exist today, where people want to withdraw from society to create the ideal society, but there's no solution in retreat or alienation or isolation. So most of them never lasted, or none of them really lasted.
That sounds like a lot of communist parties up today. Retreating into their own little space and expecting to make change.
Yeah, that's idealism. It's not going to happen. you see it happening. You know, people want to approach the struggle from the outside. You know, coming in with their own programs, positions, and so forth. They may not correspond to where people are or what the objective conditions are in society at a particular time. You know, you see it still happening. Yeah. But I think those 3 paragraphs he's trying to grapple with that.
Yeah, I'm glad you went on to that next paragraph.
Yeah.
Because that's a really key one. I think in this paragraph, he's doing 2 things that I see. First, he's saying that, you've got people that are going to come along and they're going to, like I said before, they're going to try to, these utopians are going to try to attempt to evolve, again, out of the human brain, a solution to this new problem. So again, they're sort of going to do the same thing that was done before, using reason based in thinking, not based in material conditions. And then he also goes in on this concept of model experiments, which is going to come up more. This idea that what you need to do is you need to sort of make a working model of a better society in small, kind of like a small bubble, like a commune, maybe like the perfect town or factory where everyone's sort of equal. Like they have their own little laws in this small space, and prove that that can work. And then once you prove that that'll work, that will then sort of convince everyone that it will work in a bigger, in a bigger example. So it's really kind of create a model to sort of prove yourself right, so I think. Like he really, and he kind of really goes in on it when he says, the more they were worked out in detail, the more they could not avoid drifting off into pure fantasy. So we really can see where he's going here. He's not really of the utopian persuasion. So, does anybody have any thought? Yeah.
I have a basic question that involves the title. So have we defined utopianism and utopian and scientific, or are we getting there?
I think we're getting there.
Okay, so,
maybe the utopian, I'd say he's defined that pretty well.
and that is what?
Well, like he says here, the ones who are trying to solve the new problems of capitalism by doing the same thing done before, by coming up with ideas in your head, applying reason to the problem, and B, to basically create these small models that work, but to use those models to convince everyone that, look, this is the new idea, this is what we should do. And he said, I just kind of lost my train of thought. There was an earlier passage where he talked also about the way that they apply their thinking. But I mean, he continues to go in on all this stuff as it goes forward. So it kind of keeps going around to the same ideas over and over.
Okay.
So.
I just making sure I didn't miss that part.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point he's defined utopianism. He hasn't really defined scientific socialism.
So he's defining utopianism. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, does anybody else have like a take on what they see as utopianism from what we've read?
What we've read already.
Yeah, Joe.
There's a lot of idealism that's coupled with it, so it's not basing their observations or their ideas in material conditions or in the historical conditions, but instead, like Jason was saying, coming up with these ideas just out of their head, out of nowhere, or kind of adopting like this great man status or position to try and remedy the situation that they see in front of them with their own brand new idea, because they think that'll break them out of it in a very idealistic sense, instead of observing the conditions that they live in and observing like the history that they come from, and then working from that as a model.
Great.
Imaginary solutions for real life problems.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah.
I would also say, like, thinking of ideas in a vacuum is kind of utopian. Like, thinking we can just remove context from everything, then things will be different. Like, let's just disregard the French Revolution, but this is how things should be. None of this that we talked about before matters. What is going to happen is all that matters. And I think that's kind of the basic of like what utopianism is removing context and thinking everything exists in a vacuum.
Yeah, I think that part is very important, because I run into people, when you start talking about socialism. especially in the Christian circles, some that I travel in, the first thing they think, oh, that's when you talk about socialism, that's just utopian. You can't, it never can happen. You know, they don't really know what utopian means in the context that Lenin and Marx were, I guess.
And that there's a distinction between
But
the two.
yeah, so it's not just, you know, they look at it, you can't do these things. You can't have free health care, even though we're paying our taxes for it. You know why? Why? You know, that's utopian thinking, you know, pie in the sky. That's the deception that capitalism has put on a lot of people. I think Dave knows.
So the important thing is here, Engels is not attacking Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen. But he's showing that they themselves, their ideas emerged. And this second paragraph, he says, utopians attempted to evolve out of the human brain. Society presented nothing but wrongs. So you could see by the early 1800s how awful things were, especially for the poorest people. But to remove these was the task of reason. And because they couldn't see anymore. That's how far things had developed. They couldn't see a mechanism, and so it had to come from their genius. And I think somewhere in here he starts talking about their genius was, I mean, you could read them today. And actually it's kind of interesting. They came up with so many things, brilliant ideas. This is the utopians. It's just that there was no mechanism for it to emerge, and that was not their fault. It was coming out of that period.
Yeah, when I started reading this, I was actually still really keen on this idea of utopian socialism. I said, that sounds great. Like, I want to know all about it. And I think, yeah, reading about what he says about Saint-Simon and Fourier and Owen, I was really excited. It's that they came up with some really great stuff. So yeah, I agree that he's not really attacking them, per se. So, who wants to continue?
I will.
Okay, these facts.
These facts once established, we need not dwell a moment longer upon the side of the question, now wholly belonging to the past. We can leave it to the literary small fry to solemnly quibble over these fantasies, which today only make us smile, and to crow over the superiority of their own bold reasoning, as compared with such, in quotes, insanity, in quotes. For ourselves, we delight in the stupendously grand thoughts and germ of thought that everywhere break out through their fantastic covering into which these Philistines are blind. Shall I continue?
Yeah, I think so.
Saint-Simon was a son of the great French Revolution, at the outbreak of which he was not yet 30. The revolution was the victory of the Third Estate, for example, of the great masses, of the great masses of the nation, working in production and in trade, over the privileged idle classes, the nobles and the priests. But the victory of the Third Estate soon revealed itself as exclusively the victory of the smaller part of this estate, as the conquest of political power by the socially privileged section of it. For example, the property bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie had certainly developed rapidly during the Revolution, partly by speculation in the lands of the nobility and the church, confiscated and afterwards put up for sale, and partly by frauds upon the nation by means of farming contracts. It was the domination of these swindlers that, under the Directorate, brought France to the verge of ruin, and thus gave Napoleon the pretext for his coup d'etat.
Yeah.
While this is going on, keep in mind that there's things going on in the rest of the world. While working people, rising proletariat is struggling with their own condition. Colonialism, slavery, and tremendous extraction of wealth are occurring in the so-called New World. And the French became incredibly wealthy from just the exploitation in Haiti alone, and from the other powers, the sugar trade and all that. So there's a lot of, probably even beyond how bad these people thought it was, because I don't think everyone knew or was cognizant about what was going on the other side of the Atlantic. So this is the stuff we know about today that's very horrible about the spread of capitalism from Europe to North America and South America. It's going on while all this is going on.
Right.
Piggyback on that, if
Yeah.
you don't mind.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I couldn't help thinking about Frederick Ingalls and his father who owned the cotton factory plantation, textile, cotton, whatever, in southern United States. And how, there were enslaved Africans working to produce that cotton in the factory that Ingalls' daddy owned. And how Ingalls himself, was instrumental in helping Karl Marx stay afloat through money from his father in that time frame. So I like what Mike said about how this is just a slice of what was going on, and this is what when it comes to capitalism, I can't help but think about how according to my research, some of it, the first commodities in the system of capitalism were enslaved Africans, black bodies, the very first commodities in this capitalistic system. But I don't think Ingalls is going to talk about that at all in this. I don't know. But so when I understand. I've been trying to stay in student mode. I got here late, whole bunch I don't know, but I think this is mostly. I don't feel like this cat's talking to me in my history, to a degree, but it's very important though. I do. I think it's very important.
Well, I didn't know about the American sort of industry connection with Ingalls that you're talking about.
Okay.
But do we? Yeah, we actually watched the young Karl Marx, which did, I think, go into his connection to industry and capitalism. I mean, his status as a capitalist.
Marx or Ingalls?
Engels. I mean, Marx was not, but Engels was. He was the rich son of a capitalist and an inheritor of a factory, at least in Europe. I don't know about in other countries. I don't know about all that.
Google.
But yeah, no, that's real, and I'm sure relevant and not out of line with the idea overall. I mean, do you feel like that fact and the connection there to you makes the analysis of the essay seem to not ring true? Like, does it affect it for you? I'm just curious.
No, I think that he's talking to a particular audience and he's not talking to me. But I think it's important what he's saying. I think he's talking to people who may be, descendants of those countries in Europe primarily, the French, the British, the Germans, the Dutch, etc. And he's talking from his point of view, which is the only point of view he had back in the day. And the fact that he could sit down and write makes him bourgeois to me. The fact that he had time to do this study and documentation, what have you. I mean, I don't. If it points toward the truth, it's important. It is important, no doubt about it. But I think it's important to know this, but it's important to know the other stuff too.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's really valid. I think it's a good observation. Oh yeah, did you want to?
Yeah, well, I think I think it's very important what Engels is trying to say, because he's not speaking to a particular audience. I don't think. I think he's just giving an analysis of what he sees as the evolution of our economy or economic evolution worldwide. So I think it's relevant, no matter what his status was. I mean, it's just his analysis of what he sees as what we or what they have become by then. So that's all.
I think that one of the,
I guess Sharon, you had your hand up, and then Avi.
Leona, does it feel sort of hypocritical in a way?
there's a thread of that, but again, there's a little flavor, I think, from where I'm standing.
Mhm.
It's important stuff.
Well, I was just going to say it's interesting that people in China, Vietnam, various African countries have utilized Marx and Engels to have revolutions that still exist, more so than in Europe.
Jackson.
I would also just say that's a quick other part
That's
of
history. Yeah.
being a Marxist and reading this is none of these people are infallible. Like
That people can use Marx.
Okay, come on.
Well, yeah. Well, Jackson, yeah. What were you trying? I think you're trying to make a point
Yeah,
that
I was
actually
just
connects
gonna
to you.
I'm so sorry.
No,
I
I
was
think-
just going to say the point I think is kind of important is we don't view these people as infallible. Like we realize that these people are like Engels is a rich white guy, but his analysis is important. And I think like idolizing people is definitely like Engels would be supported, or when Marx said like I don't know the exact quote, but he was like I don't take anyone seriously who calls himself a Marxist, or I wouldn't call myself a Marxist, because he didn't want infallibility. And I think that's important about this. Is these people weren't infallible, but their analysis, I think, is still important. And we can critique them, but I think the analysis is what I think matters. Like, yeah, he could like possibly or is hypocritical in these statements, but the analysis is what matters, not his character. I don't know. My view, and I exist in my own privileged sense. That's what my kind of takeaway is that these people aren't infallible. You should call them out for what they are, but I think the analysis is still there. I don't know.
Yeah, I was thinking Marx and Engels and a lot of other activists and social thinkers, organizers, do evolve over a period of time, based on material conditions. For example, a lot of the stuff Marx wrote in the 1840s, he expanded on in later decades. And Engels expanded on Marx's work and his own work. So the fact that people like Lenin, for example, even before Lenin, other people were able to utilize what Marx and Lenin wrote to, build movements. Lenin is a good example. Russia was not a highly developed capitalist society when the revolution took place. A lot of people would have thought it would have taken place on the mainland, in Western Europe, but it didn't. China, for example, same thing. So people can use scientific writings, thinking, philosophy for their own historical material conditions to transform them. That's what makes it scientific. If it's not scientific, then perhaps they can't use it.
Well,
Yeah.
we should probably just continue
Okay.
going through. I'm sure this will, more and more stuff will come up. Does anybody want to read? Okay.
As to Saint-Simon, the antagonism between the third estate and the privileged classes took the form of an antagonism between workers and idlers. The idlers were not merely the old privileged classes, but also all who, without taking any part in production or distribution, lived on their incomes. And the workers were not only the wage workers, but also the manufacturers, the merchants, the bankers. That the idlers who lost the capacity for intellectual leadership and political supremacy had been proved, and was by the revolution finally settled. That the political supremacy that the non-possessing classes had not this capacity seemed to Saint-Simon proved by the experiences of the Reign of Terror. Then who was to lead in command? According to Saint-Simon, science and industry, both united by a new religious bond, destined to restore that unity of religious ideas which had been lost since the time of the Reformation. A necessarily mystic and rigidly hierarchic new Christianity. But science, that was the scholars. And industry, that was, in the first place, the working bourgeois, manufacturers, merchants, bankers. These bourgeois were certainly intended by Saint-Simon to transfer themselves into a kind of public officials, social trustees. But they were still to hold vis-a-vis of the workers, commanding and economically privileged positions. The bankers especially would be called upon to direct the whole of social production by the regulation of credit. This conception was in exact keeping with the time in which modern industry in France, and with it, the chasm between bourgeoisie and proletariat was only just coming into existence. But what Saint-Simon especially lays stress upon is this: what interests him first, and above all other things, is the lot of the class that is the most numerous and the most poor.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot that he's going to go into about Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen's actual models that they came up with. I think it's all really interesting. I don't know, do people have reactions to this in particular? Or, I mean, it's all really fascinating to learn about, but I mean, I usually just kind of keep moving on.
Yeah.
Who else wants to read? Yeah.
Already in his Geneva letters,
A little louder.
already in his Geneva letters, Saint-Simon lays down the proposition that all men ought to live. In the same work, he recognizes also that the reign of terror was the reign of the non-possessing masses. See, says he to them, what happened in France at the time when your comrades held sway there, they brought about a famine. But to recognize the French Revolution as a class war, and not simply one between nobility and bourgeoisie, but between nobility, bourgeoisie, and the non-possessors, was, in the year 1802, a most pregnant discovery. In 1816, he declares that politics is the science of production, and foretells the complete absorption of politics by economics. The knowledge that economic conditions are the basis of political institutions appears here only in embryo. Yet what is here already very plainly expressed is the idea of the future conversion of political rule over men into an administration of things and a direction of processes of production. That is to say, the abolition of the state, about which recently there has been so much noise.
I think we should just keep going through.
Yeah, because there's a lot there
Yeah.
we talk about.
Anybody? You want to read?
Saint-Simon shows the same superiority over his contemporaries when in 1814, immediately after the entry of the Allies into Paris, and again in 1815 during the 100 Days' War, he proclaims the alliance of France and England, and then of both of these countries with Germany, as the only guarantee for the prosperous development and peace of Europe. To preach to the French in 1815 an alliance with the victors of Waterloo required as much courage as historical foresight. 1814 and 15 were the overthrow of Napoleon. Two different episodes. Continue?
Yeah.
If in Saint-Simon we find a comprehensive breadth of view, by virtue of which almost all the ideas of later socialists that are not strictly economic are found in him in embryo, we find in Fourier a criticism of the existing conditions of society, genuinely French and witty, but not upon the account of any the less thorough. Not upon that account any less thorough. Fourier takes the bourgeoisie, their inspired prophets before the Revolution, and their interested eulogists after it, at their own word. He lays bare remorselessly the material and moral misery of the bourgeois world. He confronts it with the earlier philosophers' dazzling promises of a society in which reason alone should reign, of a civilization in which happiness should be universal, of an illimitable human perfectibility, and with the rose-colored phraseology of the bourgeois ideologists of his time. He points out how everywhere the most pitiful reality corresponds with the most high-sounding phrases, and he overwhelms this hopeless fiasco of phrases with his mordant sarcasm. Fourier is not only a critic, his imperturbably serene nature makes him a satirist and assuredly one of the greatest satirists of all time. He depicts with equal power and charm the swindling speculations that blossomed out upon the downfall of the revolution, and the shopkeeping spirit prevalent in and characteristic of French commerce at the time. Still more masterly is his criticism of the bourgeois form of the relations between sexes and the position of women in bourgeois society. He was the first to declare that in any given society, the degree of women's emancipation is the natural measure of the general emancipation.
Yeah, somebody else want to continue?
I can read. But Fourier is at his greatest in his conception of the history of society. He divides his whole course thus far into 4 stages of evolution: savagery, barbarism, the patriarch, and civilization. This last is identical with the so-called civil or bourgeois society of today, i.e., with the social order that came in with the 16th century. He proves that the, quote, civilized stage raises every vice practiced by barbarism in a simple fashion into form of existence, complex, ambiguous, unequivocal, hypocritical, unquote. That civilization moves, quote, in a vicious circle, unquote, in contradictions which it constantly reproduces without being able to solve them. Hence, it constantly arrives at the very opposite to that which it wants to attain, or pretends to want to attain, so that, e.g., under civilization, property is born of superabundance itself. Fourier has
what does E.g. mean? For example?
Oh, example, yeah. Fourier, as we see, uses the dialectic method in the same masterly way as his contemporary Hegel. Using these same dialectics, he argues against talk about illimitable human perfectibility. Every historical phase has its period of ascent and also its period of descent. And he applies this observation to the future of the whole human race. As Kant introduced into natural science the idea of the ultimate destruction of the earth, Fourier introduced into historical science that of the ultimate destruction of the human race. Whilst in France, the hurricane of the revolution swept over the land. In England, a quieter but not on that account less tremendous revolution was going on. Steam and the new tool-making machinery were transforming manufacture into modern industry, and thus revolutionizing the whole foundation of bourgeois society. The sluggish march of development of the manufacturing period changed into veritable storm and stress period of production, with constantly increasing swiftness and splitting up into large capitalists and non-possessing proletarians went on. Between these, instead of the former stable middle class, an unstable mass of artisans and small shopkeepers, the most fluctuating portion of the population now led a precarious existence. The new mode of production was, as yet, only at the beginning of its period of ascent. As yet, it was the normal, regular method of production, the only one possible under existing conditions. Nevertheless, even then, it was producing crying social abuses, the herding together of a homeless population in the worst quarters of the large towns, the loosening of all traditional morals, bounds, of patriarchal subordination, of family relations, overwork, especially of women and children, to a frightful extent, complete demoralization of the working class, suddenly flung into altogether new conditions, from the country into the town, from agriculture into modern industry, from stable conditions of existence into insecure ones that change from day to day. So I think he's outlining again the shifting character of political and economic power during this period, 18th, 19th century within capitalist society.
Yeah, we should.
And then, it renders the majority still in a very, exploited, dislocated, destabilized condition.
Right. We should just keep plowing through unless people have like real clarifying questions about a particular passage or something like that. But who wants to go on? Okay.
At this juncture, they came forward as a reformer, a manufacturer, 29 years old, a man of almost sublime, childlike simplicity of character, and at the same time, one of the few born leaders of men. Robert Owen had adopted the teaching of the materialistic philosopher, that man's character is the product, on the one hand, of heredity, on the other, of the environment of the individual during his lifetime, and especially during his period of development. In the Industrial Revolution, most of his class saw only chaos and confusion, and the opportunity of fishing in these troubled waters and making large fortunes quickly. He saw in it the opportunity of putting into practice his favorite theory, and so of bringing order out of chaos. He had already tried it with success as superintendent of more than 500 men in a Manchester factory. From 1800 to 1829, he directed the great cotton mill at New Lanark in Scotland as managing partner, along the same lines, but with greater freedom of action and with a success that made him a European reputation. A population originally consisting of the most diverse and, for the most part, very demoralized elements, a population that gradually grew to 2,500, he turned into a model colony in which drunkenness, police magistrates, lawsuits, poor laws, charity were unknown. And all this simply by placing the people in conditions worthy of human beings, and especially by carefully bringing up the rising generation. He was the founder of infant schools. He introduced them first at New Lanark. At the age of 2, the children came to school, where they enjoyed themselves so much that they could scarcely be got home again. While his competitors worked their people 13 or 14 hours a day, in Lanark, the working day was only 10 and a half hours. When a crisis in cotton stopped work for 4 months, his workers received their full wages all the time. And with all this, the business more than doubled in value, and to the last yielded large profits to its proprietors. In spite of all this, Owen was not content. The existence which he secured for his workers was, in his eyes, still far from being worthy of human beings. The people were slaves at my mercy. The relatively favorable conditions in which he had placed them were still far from allowing a rational development of the character and of the intellect in all directions, much less of the free exercise of all their faculties. And yet, quote, and yet, the working part of this population of 2,500 persons was daily producing as much real wealth for society as less than half a century before. It would have required the working part of a population of 600,000 to create. I asked myself, what became of the difference between the wealth consumed by the 2,500 persons and that which would have been consumed by 600,000? unquote. The answer was clear. It had been used to pay the proprietors of the establishment 5% on the capital they had laid out, in addition to over 300,000, whatever that is, clear profit. Pounds. And that which held for New Lanark held to a still greater extent for all the factories in England. Quote, if this new wealth had not been created by machinery imperfectly as it has been applied, the wars of Europe in opposition to Napoleon and to support the aristocratic principles of society could not have been maintained. And yet this new power was the creation of the working classes, unquote.
Yeah. I mean, Robert Owen's pretty great.
Yeah.
It's pretty awesome. I mean, when I read this, I was just like, oh my God. Like, each of these guys is great. Robert Owen I was the most impressed with at this point, because he really did create this working model that I was talking about earlier, but the results of it are so impressive. And then not only that, but really at the end here, he's becoming basically a Marxian economist and analyzing, well, great, it's great that we got this far, but there's still something not right here. Like, where's the this extra value going? So he's really, really an impressive person. And I think, as you brought up earlier, David, it would be wrong to read this in the light of saying, well, these people are, to be criticized and to be sort of thrown away. That's really not at all dialectical, first of all, and it's not what he's saying. And yeah, that's really the only reaction that I have right now to say about it.
Continue.
All right. I'll read. To them, therefore, right? Is that what you said? Okay. To them, therefore, the fruits of this new power belonged. The newly created gigantic productive forces, hitherto used only to enrich individuals and to enslave the masses, offered to Owen the foundations for a reconstruction of society. They were destined, as the common property of all, to be worked for the common good of all. Owen's communism was based upon this purely business foundation, the outcome, so to say, of commercial calculation. Throughout, it maintained this practical character. Thus, in 1823, Owen proposed the relief of the distress in Ireland by communist colonies and drew up complete estimates of costs of founding them, yearly expenditure, and probable revenue. And in his definite plan for the future, the technical working out of details is managed with such practical knowledge, ground plan, front and side, and bird's eye views all included, that the Owen method of social reform, once accepted, there is, from the practical point of view, little to be said against the actual arrangement of details. His advance in the direction of communism was the turning point in Owen's life. As long as he was simply a philanthropist, he was rewarded with nothing but wealth, applause, honor, and glory. He was the most popular man in Europe. Not only men of his own class, but statesmen and princes listened to him approvingly. But when he came out with his communist theories, that was quite another thing. Three great obstacles seemed to him especially to block the path to social reform: private property, religion, and the present form of marriage. He knew what confronted him if he attacked these: outlawry, excommunication from official society, the loss of his whole social position. But nothing of this prevented him from attacking them without fear of consequences. And what he had foreseen happened. Banished from official society, with a conspiracy of silence against him in the press, ruined by his unsuccessful communist experiments in America, in which he sacrificed all his fortune, he turned directly to the working class and continued working in their midst for 30 years. Every social movement, every real advance in England on behalf of the workers links itself onto the name of Robert Owen. He forced through in 1819, after 5 years fighting, the first law limiting the hours of labor of women and children in factories. He was president of the first Congress at which all the trade unions of England united in a single great trade association. He introduced, as transition measures to the complete communistic organization of society, on the one hand, cooperative societies for retail and production. These have since that time, at least, given practical proof that the merchant and the manufacturer are socially quite unnecessary. On the other hand, he introduced labor bazaars for the exchange of the products of labor through the medium of labor notes, whose unit was a single hour of work. Institutions necessarily doomed to failure, but completely anticipating Proudhon's Bank of Exchange of a much later period, and differing entirely from this in that it did not claim to be a panacea for all social ills, but only a first step towards a much more radical revolution of society. So, yeah, basically he's really, really, really great. Did a lot of good stuff.
Kind of, when I hear someone who started one way and then because they changed their philosophy or views, that, they were lauded in one area, but once they changed their views and start thinking about people instead of money, their support changed. And I always think of Martin Luther King when that happened. They were perfectly satisfied with Martin, worrying about just thinking about race. They could capitalize on that. When he started talking about their money and how to distribute that and treat other people, not just blacks in society, but all people, all workers, they killed him real quick.
Yeah.
I personally just find it kind of funny that towards the end, since Engels and Marx both like to talk shit at Prohound, because they thought he was kind of dumb. Well, he was also like a contemporary with them. I just like how he's like at the end he talks about completely anticipating Prohound's Bank of Exchange in a much later period, and different from this, as he did not claim to be panacea on all social ills, but only a first step forward. I just find that kind of funny because he's calling out Prohound for being a utopian and thinking that like this one thing can solve everything. So I just personally found that kind of funny that a lot of these writings are just going after in some of their writings they go after other peers that they think are doing something that they're critiquing just because I don't know. I just personally find that kind of funny.
Yeah, he's doing tossing a little barb at it.
Yeah.
Finish this.
Yeah, all right. Who wants to continue? Anyone? Yeah. Or you want to go ahead?
Yeah,
you haven't really.
go ahead.
Just
Okay.
to the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just one last paragraph.
The utopian's mode of thought has for a long time governed the socialist ideas of the 19th century and still governs some of them. Until very recently, all French and English socialists did homage to it. The earlier German communism, including that of Whiteling, was of the same school. To all these, socialism is the expression of absolute truth, reason, and justice, and is only to be discovered to conquer all the world by virtue of its own power. And as absolute truth is independent of time, space, and of the historical development of man, it is a mere accident when and where it is discovered. With all this, absolute truth, reason, and justice are different with the founder of each different school. And as each one's special kind of absolute truth, reason, and justice is again conditioned by his subjective understanding, his conditions of existence, the measures of his knowledge, and his intellectual training, there is no other ending possible in this conflict of absolute truths than that they shall be mutually exclusive one of the other. Hence, from this, nothing could come out of but a kind of eclectic, average socialism, which, as a matter of fact, has up to the present time dominated the minds of the most of the socialist workers in France and England. Hence, a mishmash allowing of the most manifold shades of opinion, a mishmash of such critical statements, economic theories, pictures of future society by the founders of different sects, as excite a minimum of opposition, a mishmash which is the more easily brewed, the more the definite sharp edges of the individual constituents are rubbed down in the stream of debate like rounded pebbles in a brook. To make a science of socialism, it had first to be placed upon a real basis.
Awesome. You finished.
Just tell people why you agree.
Oh yeah. So I also included after the notes here, page 11. This is just from the Communist Manifesto, which, as I said before, I think it was written about 50 years earlier, something like that. But it's part from the third part of the Communist Manifesto, and it's their analysis of utopian socialism from that. So it's worthwhile, I think, to read. It's much shorter, obviously. And when I first read the Communist Manifesto, I think when I went through that part, I was kind of like, okay, he's talking about a lot of different ideas here. I think he doesn't like a lot of them. But I'm just going to kind of keep going, and I think the first part of the manifesto was what I really latched onto. But now, having read this, I think they kind of go through everything really quickly. So it's worth giving it a read. It's there if you want to look at it. So, yeah.
Jackson,
You did it.
you know?
Oh, I kind of realized something. I think my phone, if it doesn't like get touched, just kind of went off. I have no idea why, because it should have constantly been recording.
It's too much.
It might have been
memory
too
or
much.
something. Or
Yeah, and then I also discovered that apparently, if you don't have 1,000 subs on YouTube, you can't live stream.
Right, that's true.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I wasn't used to that.
I actually-
My old channel had 2,000.
I've actually been recording this for just right
Okay.
here, just to keep for later.
You go.
So.
Jason had it under control. I am a failure.
No.
Thank you, Jason.
No,
Yeah, let's give Jason a second round. Jason is a competent individual.
You
Sorry?
certainly learned some things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we were discussing doing another session. I don't know, maybe in a few weeks. But would people be interested in moving on to the second part?
Oh yeah.
Okay, great. So I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's important. I mean, here he critiques, utopianism and utopian socialism, but he's building up to a larger argument. So we need to continue.
Did we have a date?
I think it was 2 weeks hence. Does anybody have
If we could do it on Saturday.
22nd?
I actually have an event that's going
February 22nd, is that it?
If anybody would be interested.
I don't think we really decided.
The 20. Yeah, the
To
22nd.
see how this went first.
We already have a full schedule for February?
No.
We left that date open. But I think we'll put it back out to the Facebook group, and it's probably going to be on the 22nd in 2 weeks, and it'll be the same thing for part 2.
So we have
5 p.m. And we'll do chapter 2.
Awesome.
And we'll do printouts for that.
That's perfect.
And yeah, awesome. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to mention, I read this many years, I don't want to tell my age, in the late 1970s. I was a university student when I first read it. And, every time I read it, I always, like to read it because you get something out of it every time that you read it. It's like
the Bible.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I've read the Bible cover to cover. And,
Just move on from that.
you get more out of it. If you read it, you get more out of it.
Right.
So you listen to somebody else's interpretation of the Bible, or Engels, or Marx, or Lenin, or whoever. So,
Yeah. I mean,
Yes, I think March 8th is International Women's Day, and that's a Sunday, but on March 7th, in this office, there'll be an International Women's Day program. Sharon is not in the room, but she probably was going to announce it. And we're going to be showing the movie Harriet. I believe it's the 7th of March, is a Saturday. And at 5 p.m., and men will be cooking dinner.
A vegan dinner?
Probably a selection of stuff. It hasn't been
diversity.
Well, Sharon's vegan, and if it's her, then she would want it to be.
Well, we'll consult.
Yeah,
It's
the
fine
movie
with me.
Harriet came out late last year, and I wrote a review of the film, which was published on Fighting Words, which is a journal that's published out of this building. So people may want to go look at the.
Oh yeah, I must have missed that article. I'm just gonna check it out because I haven't seen the movie. It's different.
You can see it all.
Yeah. While we're at it, maybe we should just briefly report that some of us went today to a protest against Trump's steal of the century, anti-Palestinian. He announced a settlement of the Middle East crisis between Israel and Palestine to a room which didn't include one Palestinian, and it's been rejected by the Palestinian leadership, masses, the Arab masses. And there was a nice protest march throughout downtown. And if you want to read more about the deal of the century, fightingwords.net, fighting-words.net. We have an article called Palestine Will Be Free. So there's a lot of articles. If you're not reading there, we're posting every few days articles. Some people here writing them, some people around the country.
And we also have pamphlets of articles that we're offering.
They're available if you want to buy.
That we ask $3 donation.
$2 or $3. They're on the table out front. I laid them out.
So,
if you want to look.
Could we say that Trump's position on Palestine is utopian imperialism?
Some kind of.
But also, if you want to see the demonstration, Abiyomi filmed it and he put it on Facebook and other places, and I sent it around as well, so you can see some of it. Yeah, like
Spirit of demonstration.
Yeah. It was great.
Also, we had a fundraiser at the Detroit Repertory Theater this week. The play, The Puppeteer. You know, we do that every year to raise funds and also to support cultural institutions in the city.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Well, I want to thank Jason.
Well, great job, Jason.
Thanks for coming.
Looking forward to 2 weeks.
All right.
Keep these too.
Yeah, and keep your printout,
Yeah, I'll share
and
this.
there'll be another one.
And they can read where they can be able to read part 2.
Well, yeah, I'll make a new event, by the way, everybody, and send an event out, and there will be a link to Chapter 2. Also, if you have the link for Chapter 1, it's just the next, at the bottom, just click to Chapter 2.
This is much easier to read than anti-Durant.
Which this was a part of that.
Anti-During is a great time.
I think this was a part of that.
Really?
Yeah, original.
Yeah, it was one of the parts.
I haven't read it yet. I have a copy, I haven't read it yet.
It's about like this nature.